The Chinook came in low over the Hindu Kush, its rotors cutting through air so thin and cold it felt like breathing through glass. Below, the mountains stretched in every direction, ancient, indifferent, the color of bone. Phoebe Ridgecrest sat in the valley like something dropped there by accident. Plywood and sandbags in concertina wire. Guard towers at each corner. A small American flag hanging limp in the windless afternoon. Staff Sergeant Lexi Carr had not spoken a single word during the 2-hour flight from Bagram. She sat in the cargo bay with her back against the fuselage, both hands wrapped around the stock of her M110 SAS rifle, the way most people hold the hand of someone they love. Not slung across her back, not resting across her knees. Held, present, alive in her grip. The other passengers, replacements, a supply officer, a journalist who had already given up trying to get a quote, had stopped looking at her somewhere over the second mountain range. There was something in her stillness that made people uncomfortable. Not aggression, not hostility. Something quieter and more unsettling than either. She looked like a woman waiting for something she already knew was coming. When the ramp dropped, she was the first one off. 5 feet 6 inches, 132 pounds. Brown hair pulled back, gray eyes scanning the perimeter before her boots fully touched the ground. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing many times before, stepping off the ramp of a helicopter into a new base, a new dust, a new set of faces that didn't know her yet. Specialist Garrett Lunn was standing near the landing zone with 2 other soldiers when she came down the ramp. He was 24, broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of someone who had never yet been badly wrong about anything important. He watched her walk past and said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "They sent us a girl who sleeps with her rifle." Nobody corrected him. Lieutenant Derek Wall stood waiting at the edge of the landing zone, his uniform faded from 5 months in the Afghan sun. He was 34 years old and had read Lexi Carr's file twice on the flight in from battalion headquarters. He had found himself reading it a third time that morning, sitting in his plywood office with cold coffee and a feeling he couldn't quite name. The file was extraordinary. 134 confirmed kills. A silver star for valor in Helmand Province. Expert marksman ratings that the range instructors at Fort Bragg had apparently argued about for weeks, not because they doubted the scores, but because they couldn't agree on how to properly document something that far outside the standard bell curve. But there were also 4 separate psychological evaluations, all of them inconclusive. All of them eventually overturned on appeal. Each one cleared with the same result: fit for duty. The notes from her previous commanding officer were brief, a single handwritten line at the bottom of her transfer paperwork. Keep her rifle close to her. Don't ask why yet. Results speak. Wall had stared at that line for a long time. He extended his hand when she reached him. She shifted the rifle to her left hand, never letting go, never loosening her grip, and shook briefly with her right. "Staff Sergeant Carr, welcome to FOB Ridgecrest." "Sir," she glanced past him toward the base. "Where's my bunk assignment? I'd like to get settled and walk the perimeter before dark." He blinked. He had prepared a small speech about the base, the mission, the team. He set it aside. "Corporal Voss will show you." Corporal Tara Voss was the unit's combat medic, 26 years old, with the steady hands and the slightly too careful way of observing people that came from spending her days keeping broken things alive. She stepped forward with a professional smile. "This way, Sergeant. We've got you in Building 3 with the rest of—" She stopped mid-sentence. Lexi had already walked past her, rifle in both hands, eyes moving across the base in a slow, deliberate arc. Not a casual glance, a survey. The kind of look that measures angles and distances and sight lines without appearing to do anything of the sort. Voss looked at Wall. Wall looked at the ground. Building 3 was standard construction. Plywood walls, sandbag foundation, 12 bunks in a space that smelled of gun oil and the particular red dust that worked its way into everything in Kunar province. 8 soldiers were inside when Lexi arrived, some cleaning weapons, 2 playing cards in the corner. Sergeant Frank Otwell, the platoon sergeant, was sitting on his bunk reading a letter from home for what looked like the 3rd or 4th time. He was 42 years old and built like a man who had spent 2 decades carrying heavy things over difficult ground, because that was exactly what he had done. He looked up when Lexi walked in. He stood, extended his hand. "Sergeant Otwell, platoon sergeant, you must be..." Lexi walked past him directly to the bunk that had been prepared for her. She set her rucksack down. Then, without a word to anyone, she moved the bed 6 inches to the left. The room went quiet. She tested the sight lines, both exits visible. Window to her left, northern wall straight ahead. She pulled the thin mattress up, checked the frame, set it back down. Then she began unpacking with the kind of systematic precision that suggested she had done this in the dark, under fire, in places where taking an extra 30 seconds might have meant something irreversible. Ammunition in a specific zone near her right hand. Maintenance kit within reach. Hydration system positioned where she could grab it without looking. The rifle never left her hands. When she needed both hands for unpacking, she did things with one hand and held the rifle with the other. When she couldn't manage that, she set the rifle on the bed directly beside her, with her hand resting on the receiver, never more than 3 inches from her palm. Lund, sitting across the room, watched all of this with the open fascination of someone watching something slightly strange at a carnival. "She gonna sleep with it too?" he murmured to the soldier beside him, just quiet enough to seem like he wasn't saying it for an audience, just loud enough that the whole room heard. Lexi's head turned slightly, not sharply, not with anger, just enough to show she had heard. Her expression didn't change. She went back to unpacking. Otwell sat back down on his bunk and picked up his letter again. But he wasn't reading it. He was watching her. In 15 years of service, he had seen combat stress express itself in 100 different ways. The hypervigilance, the sleeplessness, the inability to separate from weapons, the constant state of low-level readiness that never fully switched off. He had seen men come back from bad deployments carrying all of it like weight sewn into their clothing. What he was looking at now was something different. This wasn't a soldier who couldn't turn off. This was a soldier who had made a decision not to. There was a distinction there. He wasn't sure yet what it meant, but he made a note to find out. Evening chow was served in the main hall, a larger plywood structure with actual tables and a serving line. Lexi entered last, and every eye in the room tracked her the way eyes track something that moves differently from everything else. She carried her rifle through the serving line. She sat down, placed it across her lap, and ate one-handed. Lund, 3 seats down, watched for a full 30 seconds before he said it. "She's actually eating with one hand so she doesn't have to put it down. I'm watching that happen right now." Lieutenant Wall decided to address it directly. "Staff Sergeant Carr," his voice was level, not unkind, "the armory here is secure. You can store your weapon there when you're off duty. It's standard practice." Lexi looked up from her tray. Her expression was calm, unhurried. She wasn't embarrassed, and she wasn't defiant. She was simply certain. "With respect, sir, my rifle stays with me, always. The regulation allows for personal retention of assigned weapons at the commander's discretion, sir. I'm requesting that discretion." She held his gaze without aggression. "My rifle is maintained to a higher standard than general armory inventory. I'm responsible for its readiness. I take that responsibility seriously." Wall studied her for a long moment. She was technically correct about the regulation. He knew it, and she knew he knew it. There was no theater in the way she said it. No performance of toughness, no defiance for its own sake. Just a fact, stated flatly, by someone who had clearly stated it before. He let it go. "It stays with you, but it's secured when you sleep." "It will be, sir." What he couldn't have known, what none of them understood yet, was what Lexi Carr's definition of secured meant. To her, secured meant in her hands, under her control, within her immediate reach, every second of every day. That night, as the platoon settled into their bunks, Lexi lay down fully clothed, boots loosely laced for quick donning. She positioned herself on her side, the M110 cradled lengthwise along her body, her right arm draped across the receiver in the easy, unconscious way that other people hold a pillow. Her eyes closed, but her breathing never reached the slow depth of real sleep. She remained at the surface, aware of every sound, every shift in the ambient noise of the base. From across the room, Lund shook his head in the dark. "That is not a normal person," he whispered to Voss in the next bunk. Voss kept her voice low and professional. "She's adjusting. New deployment, new unit. Give her time." Otwell said nothing. He lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling and listened to the FOB settle into its nighttime rhythm. Generators humming, radio chatter from the guard towers, the distant sound of wind coming down off the mountains. He didn't think Lexi Carr needed time to adjust. He thought she had already adjusted. He just didn't understand yet what she had adjusted to. In the darkness, Lexi's eyes opened for a moment. She could feel the room around her, the sleeping weight of it, the shallow safety that good people allowed themselves when they were inside the wire, surrounded by concrete barriers and guard towers, and the assumption that all the preparation and precaution was enough. She had believed that once. She had believed that preparation was something you turned in at the end of the day, along with your weapon. Owen Decker had died because of that belief. Her fingers found the engraving on the rifle's stock. She had done it herself, the night after FOB Kestrel, with the tip of her combat knife in hands that still weren't completely steady. The letters were small and uneven and permanent. For Owen and Kestrel 7, never again. She closed her eyes. Somewhere beyond the wire, beyond the guard towers and their small pools of light, the mountains sat in total darkness, immense, patient, full of things that moved at night and watched during the day. The FOB slept. Lexi Carr did not. The morning sun crested the ridgeline at 0612, and Lexi was already sitting on the edge of her bunk, field stripping her rifle with the automatic efficiency of someone performing a ritual they have completed 10,000 times. Each component laid out on a cleaning mat in a sequence that never varied. Barrel, bolt carrier group, charging handle, upper receiver. She ran a bore brush through the barrel with long, even strokes, and the room around her was still in the early quiet before reveille. Lund stumbled toward the latrine and stopped when he registered what he was seeing. The rifle was completely disassembled, every component placed with the precision of a surgical instrument layout. "You sleep at all, Sergeant?" "Enough," she said without looking up. He stood there for another moment, something working its way across his face that was not quite the easy mockery from the night before. Then he continued to the latrine. By 0700, Alpha Platoon assembled for the daily patrol brief. Wall outlined the route, a presence patrol through 3 nearby villages, Hearts and Mines. Lexi would provide overwatch from elevated positions while the main element moved through the valley floor. But Lexi was not looking at the patrol route. Her eyes were fixed on a different section of the map entirely, the northern ridgeline, the series of draws and ravines and rocky high ground that overlooked FOB Ridgecrest from approximately 1,200 meters. "Something wrong, Sergeant Carr?" Wall asked. "What's our observation coverage on this sector, sir?" Her finger traced the ridgeline. "Sensors, cameras, scheduled patrol." "That's outside our normal patrol area. Quiet sector. We've got ground sensors and camera coverage from Tower 4 gives us partial." She studied the map a moment longer. "Just familiarizing myself with the terrain, sir." But she kept looking at those mountains. Her eyes moved across the high ground the way a doctor's hands move across skin they suspect is hiding something. Not randomly, but searching for the specific location of something that shouldn't be there. The patrol went without major incident until it didn't. 3 Taliban fighters emerged from a tree line at a range of 823 meters. They moved with the confidence of men who believed the distance made them safe. The first shot came before most of the patrol had fully registered the contact. The lead fighter dropped. The second shot caught the man attempting to flank left before he had taken 3 full steps. The third round found the last insurgent mid-stride, turning to run. 11 seconds, 3 shots, no misses. "Did you see that?" Voss said into her radio, her voice carrying the involuntary awe of someone watching something that shouldn't be physically possible. Lund didn't answer for a moment. When he did, his voice had lost its usual ease. "Yeah, I saw it." When they returned to FOB Ridgecrest that afternoon, something had shifted in the way the platoon moved around Lexi Carr. Not respect exactly, not yet. Something more provisional. The particular silence that falls around a thing you don't fully understand but can no longer dismiss. Lexi noticed none of it, or appeared not to. While the rest of the platoon cleaned weapons and wrote after-action reports, she requisitioned a digital camera from the supply sergeant, collected her notebook, and climbed the access ladder to Tower 4. For the next 3 hours, she photographed the northern ridgeline with systematic thoroughness. Not casual documentation, coverage. The same positions at different times of day, tracking exactly how afternoon light fell across the rocky terrain, where shadows pooled in the ravines, where a clear line of sight to the FOB existed, and where the dead ground interrupted it. She filled 14 pages of her notebook with measurements, bearing angles, and distance estimates to specific terrain features. Otwell found her there at sunset, still working. "Carr," his voice was even, "what exactly are you doing?" "Baseline documentation," she said, not lowering the camera. "Baseline for what?" She lowered the camera then and turned to look at him with those gray eyes that had the quality of still water, calm on the surface and impossible to determine how deep they went. "If something changes up there," she said, "I'll know it changed." "Changed how?" "Like someone watching us who shouldn't be there." Otwell felt something move through him that he would later describe, to himself and no one else, as the feeling of a door opening in a house he had thought was empty. He looked out at the ridgeline. The mountains were turning purple in the dying light, beautiful in the specific, merciless way of beautiful things that don't care about you at all. "You see something specific?" "Not yet," she said, "but I'm looking." She turned back to the camera. Otwell stood beside her for a moment, then climbed back down the ladder. He didn't mention it to Wall that evening. He wasn't sure why. Something about the certainty in her voice made him feel like it would be wrong to water it down before it had finished becoming what it was trying to become. At dinner that night, the team's unease had taken on a different texture. Lexi sat at the far end of the table, as she always did, rifle across her lap, back to the wall, eyes tracking every entrance and exit with the patient regularity of a security camera. Lund had been watching her for 3 days now, and the mockery in his voice had slowly been replaced by something he wasn't sure he had a name for. "It's getting weirder," he said quietly to Voss. "Now she's photographing rocks, writing everything down." Voss didn't take the bait. "She made 3 kills today that I could not have made with twice the preparation time." "That's exactly what bothers me," Otwell said quietly. "She's hyper-competent in contact, but she can't turn it off outside of contact either." He nodded toward the far end of the table. "She's running a threat assessment on the chow hall right now. Look at her eyes." Wall had been listening. He had also been watching. He had been watching since she stepped off the helicopter. Every time he thought he had found a framework for understanding her, something in it slipped. Before he could speak, Lexi stood abruptly. She moved to the doorway without explanation and stood there, very still, looking out into the darkness toward the northern end of the base. The posture of someone listening to a frequency the people around them cannot hear. "Sergeant Carr," Wall said, appearing beside her. "What is it?" She was quiet for a moment. Her eyes didn't move from the dark ridgeline, barely visible against the slightly less dark sky. Then she shook her head, almost imperceptibly. Nothing. Probably nothing. She walked back to the table and sat down and picked up her fork, but she did not eat. That night, long after the base had gone quiet and the last card game had ended and the generators had settled into their steady, humming rhythm, Lexi sat in the dark at the foot of her bunk with her laptop open, reviewing the day's photographs one more time. She had been through them twice already. Now she was going through them a third time with the kind of focused attention that gets sharper the longer it holds, not duller. In the third photograph she had taken that afternoon, then in the seventh, then, going back to an image from 2 days before, she had barely registered at the time, in that one too, a pinpoint of reflected light, faint, consistent, coming from the same position on the northern ridgeline, a rocky shelf approximately 1,200 meters out, in a sector that should have been completely unoccupied and had no reason to be otherwise. Scope glint. She sat very still. She cross-referenced the timestamps against the patrol schedule, the guard rotation log, and the supply delivery record she had memorized during her first afternoon. The pattern was not ambiguous once you were looking for it. Every time FOB Ridgecrest had generated significant, observable activity, a helicopter arrival, a full company patrol departure, a supply convoy, the reflection appeared. And only then. Someone was up there with optics. Someone was watching them. Not randomly, not opportunistically, systematically. The way a professional watches a target before an operation. The way you study a lock before you pick it. Lexi pulled out her topographical map and a red pen. She began marking. If she were planning an assault on this FOB, and she had spent years thinking about exactly this kind of problem, because the alternative was to stop thinking about it, and she had promised herself she would never stop. Where would she stage? Where would she approach from? Where were the gaps in the sensor coverage, the overlapping blind spots between the guard towers, the covered approaches that the existing patrol pattern consistently failed to observe? The northern ridgeline answered every question. The wadi that ran north to south, invisible to Tower 4's camera angle. The ravine system that channeled directly toward the perimeter at a point between Tower 4 and Tower 5, where she had already noted on her first afternoon that the fields of fire didn't fully overlap. The elevated firing positions that would allow a support element to suppress the guard towers while a breaching team moved on the perimeter wire. She checked the lunar calendar on her phone. New moon in 4 days. She sat in the dark with her red pen and her map, and the cold certainty of a woman who had learned the most important lesson of her life in the worst possible way, in the worst possible place, on the worst possible night, and had been carrying it ever since. She had seen this pattern before. At FOB Kestrel, she had seen the surveillance, the changed behavior in the surrounding villages, the small wrongnesses that accumulated beneath the threshold of official concern until there were too many of them to explain away individually, and by then it was too late. At FOB Kestrel, she had let herself be talked out of it. She had decided to be normal for one night, to sleep like the other soldiers, to lock her rifle in the armory where the regulations said it belonged, and trust that all the barriers and protocols and systems would hold. Owen Decker had run toward the armory to get her rifle for her. He had been shot in the back, 11 meters from the door. 7 people died that night. She had survived by lying still for 4 hours under the weight of her teammates' bodies, while enemy fighters walked through the building around her. And she had done it, weaponless, helpless, reduced to the role of witness to a catastrophe she had seen coming and had failed to stop. She pressed the tip of the red pen to the map and drew a line from the northern ridgeline down through the wadi to the perimeter. Then another line, then another. By the time the first gray light began to find the edges of the plywood walls, she had 17 pages of analysis, 12 annotated photographs, and the absolute bone-deep certainty of someone who has seen the future and knows with complete clarity that the only question remaining is whether anyone will listen before it arrives. She looked down at the inscription on her rifle stock. For Owen and Kestrel 7, never again. Then she began writing the report. The report was 17 pages long. Lexi had written it by hand first, in the careful block letters she used when she needed her thinking to be precise, then transferred it to the laptop in the gray hour before reveille. Annotated photographs printed from the supply office's aging printer. Topographical overlays with red markings at every key terrain feature. A timeline cross-referencing the scope glint sightings against FOB Ridgecrest's observable activity schedule. Vehicle track analysis from the dried wadi bed north of the perimeter, documented with photographs and measurements. She had been awake for 31 hours when she knocked on Lieutenant Wall's door at 05:45. He opened it in a t-shirt, coffee in hand, and looked at the folder she was holding, and then at her face and understood immediately that whatever this was, it was not going to be a short conversation. "Sir," she said, "FOB Ridgecrest is going to be attacked, probably within 72 hours. She spread the documentation across his folding table before he had fully processed the sentence. Wall set down his coffee. He leaned forward, and Lexi walked him through every piece of it with the measured, unhurried clarity of someone who has rehearsed this exact moment in their mind many times, because they understood that the presentation of the evidence would matter as much as the evidence itself. The scope glint photographs first. 3 images, 3 separate days, the same position on the northern ridgeline each time, the reflection appearing only during periods of significant base activity. She had marked the precise pixel location in each image and overlaid them to demonstrate the spatial consistency. Not different rocks catching afternoon light at different angles. The same point, the same elevation, every single time. Then the village documentation. The family compound she had surveyed during their first patrol, 17 occupants counted, all but 4 gone by the following week. Every adult male of fighting age absent. The shepherd routes along the northern valley floor that had followed the same patterns for, by local accounts, at least 2 generations, routes that had stopped, abruptly, 3 days ago. Children who had played in the open ground outside the nearest village every afternoon, without exception, were no longer visible. Then the wadi, the vehicle tracks she had documented and measured, the tread pattern inconsistent with any civilian vehicle operating in this area, consistent with a military-grade transport carrying significant weight. Someone had moved something heavy through that drainage channel within the past 48 hours. Something heavy enough to compress the hardpan soil to a depth she had measured and recorded. Finally, the tactical analysis. The annotated map with approach routes, breach points, fields of fire, sensor blind spots, the dead ground between Tower 4 and Tower 5 that she had identified on her first afternoon. The covered approach through the wadi that would allow a substantial force to reach within 200 meters of the perimeter wire without triggering the existing ground sensors. Wall studied each page in silence. When he reached the tactical analysis, he was quiet for a long time. "The scope glints," he said finally. "These could be sunlight on rock." "At 04:30, sir." Lexi pulled a photograph from the back of the folder, time-stamped before dawn. A faint, unmistakable pinpoint of artificial light from the darkness of the ridgeline. "That's not sunlight. A shepherd with a flashlight." "No shepherd maintains the same position for 3-hour intervals, sir. No shepherd consistently appears only during our highest activity periods and disappears during quiet times. That's reconnaissance. Systematic, professional reconnaissance." Wall sat back. He wanted to believe her. The evidence was compelling in a way that made him slightly uncomfortable, because compelling evidence coming from a soldier with 4 psychological evaluations in her file put him in a position he didn't want to be in. He looked at the photographs again. He looked at the map. "I need to take this to Captain Finch," he said. Lexi said nothing, but something moved briefly across her face. Not surprise and not quite resignation. Something in between. The expression of a person who has made this exact trip before and knows with precision how it ends. Captain Howard Finch had the office at the end of the command building, and he had occupied it with the particular settled quality of a man who had made peace with his surroundings because he knew exactly how long he would be in them. 52 years old, 30 years of service, 11 weeks remaining before he rotated back to Fort Campbell, and within 6 months of that, to a house in eastern Tennessee where his wife had already picked out the paint colors for the guest bedroom he was going to convert into a workshop. He listened to Lexi's briefing with his hands folded on the desk, and his expression politely attentive in the way of a man whose mind has already formed its conclusion and is waiting for the presentation to finish. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "Sergeant Carr," he said, "I appreciate your vigilance. Genuinely." His tone was not unkind. It was the tone of a doctor delivering a diagnosis he has delivered many times before. "But I can't put this entire FOB on full alert status because shepherds change their routes, and you observe some reflections on a hillside. Sir, it's considerably more than—" "I read your file before you arrived." He picked up a pen, turned it between his fingers. "4 psychological evaluations. All cleared, I understand that. But the clinical notes are consistent across all 4 assessments. A documented pattern of hypervigilance, difficulty distinguishing between confirmed threats and perceived threats, a tendency to identify patterns in ambiguous data." The room was very quiet. "The patterns are not ambiguous, Captain." Her voice was controlled. Each word placed carefully, like someone walking on uncertain ground, who knows that the way she moves matters as much as the destination. "They are documented, cross-referenced, and consistent over a period of 8 days. Finch looked at her steadily. "Noted. We'll increase perimeter patrols and add an additional guard rotation on the northern towers." He set down the pen. "But I'm not going to full alert status on the basis of this analysis." Dismissed. Outside the command building, Wall caught up with her on the pathway between structures. The morning was heating up fast, the way it always did in the valley, the temperature climbing 30 degrees between sunrise and mid-morning. "Carr," he fell into step beside her, "I know that wasn't what you wanted." "He's wrong, sir." She kept walking, her voice tight in the specific way of someone managing something they do not want to display. "In 3 days, maybe less, they're coming, and when they do, the northern perimeter is where they'll hit hardest. I believe you're concerned. I believe some of your analysis is solid, but you have to understand how this looks." She stopped walking and turned to face him. The gray eyes were very still. "Like I'm unstable. Like I'm seeing threats that aren't there. I know exactly how it looks, Lieutenant. I have been hearing that exact assessment my entire career." She held his gaze. "Right up until the moment I'm proven right." Wall was quiet for a moment. There was something behind her eyes that he had been circling around since she arrived. Something that explained the rifle, and the sleeplessness, and the 4 psychological evaluations, and the single handwritten line from her previous commander. He had been approaching it carefully, the way you approach something that might be fragile or might be sharp, not sure yet which. "What happened at your last posting?" he asked. "Your file mentions an incident, no details." The pause that followed lasted long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she turned and kept walking, and after a moment she began to speak. Her voice was level. The particular flatness of someone describing something at a significant distance from themselves. The way combat veterans sometimes talk about fire, matter-of-factly, without inflection, because inflection would cost more than they want to spend. "FOB, Kestrel, Kunar Province, 14 months ago." She had been the unit's only sniper. She had noticed the same pattern building over the same number of days. The surveillance, the changed village behavior, the accumulation of small wrongnesses beneath the threshold of official concern. She had reported it. The report had been acknowledged and filed, and nothing had changed. She had been off duty the night of the attack. Her rifle was locked in the armory. She had been trying for once to sleep normally, to put the weapon in its proper place and trust the systems that were supposed to be enough. Owen Decker had come for her when the first explosion hit. He was her spotter, her best friend in the unit, the person who knew her shooting the way a musician knows a key, who could tell by the angle of her body before she pulled the trigger whether the shot was going to land true. He had run toward the armory in the dark to get her rifle for her. He was shot 11 meters from the armory door. She had survived by lying under the bodies of her teammates for 4 hours, weaponless, listening to the sounds of a battle she should have been able to stop. 7 dead total. Wall stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the dusty pathway between buildings and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish what she had just told him. Lexi looked at him steadily. "So yes, sir, I sleep with my rifle. I see threats in every shadow. I document and analyze and plan for scenarios that may never materialize." A pause. "And the one time I didn't, the one time I tried to be the soldier everyone thought I should be, Owen Decker ran 11 meters in the dark and died for it." She turned and walked toward the barracks. Wall stood alone in the morning heat for a long time after she had gone. That afternoon, Otwell found her back on the northern perimeter wall, photographing the ridgeline in the flat midday light. He climbed up and stood beside her without speaking for a while, watching her work. "Wall told me about the meeting," he said finally. "Then you know." "Nobody believes you." She lowered the camera and showed him the latest photographs on the screen. Fresh tire tracks in the wadi bed, captured that morning. The compression pattern of a heavy vehicle, the tread marks partially obscured but present along the northern bank. Someone drove in there recently. No civilian reason to be in that area. It's rocks and hardpan and nothing else. Otwell studied the image. He had 20 years of experience looking at ground and reading it, and what he saw in that photograph was not a shepherd's cart or a farmer's truck. The track width, the depth, the pattern, those measurements corresponded to something much heavier and much more purposefully built. "What are you going to do?" he asked. She looked at him with those calm gray eyes. "What I always do," she said. "Be ready." He nodded slowly. He didn't tell her he believed her. Not yet, not fully, not with the completeness that she deserved. But he didn't dismiss it either. He stood on the wall beside her for another hour while she documented and measured and recorded, and he thought about what it cost a person to carry a certainty that no one around them shared, day after day, in a place where being wrong cost lives and being right cost the same. That evening, the platoon gathered in the barracks, and the tension that had been building since Lexi's arrival had settled into something almost comfortable in its familiarity, the way that chronic discomfort eventually becomes background noise. Lund was openly vocal about what he called Carr's shadow jumping. Others exchanged the careful, sidelong looks of people who have not made up their minds but are watching the process. Voss sat down beside Lexi on her bunk while the others talked among themselves. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I looked at those photographs you showed Wall. The timeline correlation is not nothing." Lexi said nothing for a moment. She was cleaning her rifle. The evening ritual, the barrel brush moving in long, even strokes. "It's not nothing," she agreed. "How are you holding up?" Lexi looked at her. The question seemed to land somewhere unexpected, as though holding up was a concept she didn't normally apply to herself. "I'm fine. You haven't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since you got here." "I sleep enough." Voss looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded and let it go. She was a medic, and she understood that some injuries were not in her scope of practice, not because they were beyond treatment, but because the person carrying them had made a decision about them that she had no authority to override. The next morning brought the second piece of evidence that Lexi had been waiting for. She had been awake since 0300, sitting at her bunk with her notebook and her maps, running the tactical analysis for the 14th time. Not because she expected to find something new, but because the repetition kept it sharp and immediate in her mind. At 5:30, she walked the northern perimeter wall in the early gray light, as she had every morning since arriving, with her camera and her measuring tape and the patient, methodical attention of someone documenting a crime scene. The tracks in the wadi had multiplied overnight. Not one vehicle, multiple vehicles, making multiple passes along the same route, the compression patterns overlapping in a way that suggested organized movement, supplies, personnel, or both, transported into the dead ground north of the FOB under cover of darkness. The hard-pan soil of the wadi bed was not designed to hold impressions for long in the Afghan heat, but these were fresh enough that the edges of the tread marks were still crisp. She photographed everything, measured everything, added it to the folder. Then she took the folder to Finch. He looked at the photographs. He listened to her explanation. He nodded with the attentive expression of a man who has already made his decision and is waiting for the other person to finish speaking. "I'll pass this up the chain," he said. "Let battalion take a look." "Sir, the new moon is in 2 days." "I understand, Sergeant. I'll get it to battalion today." She left his office with the folder and the photographs and the systematic, well-documented certainty of everything she had spent 8 days building. And she sat on the edge of her bunk and looked at the northern wall of the barracks, and she waited for the response from battalion that she already knew was not coming. What Lexi did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Finch had placed her folder in the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of routine supply requisitions, without making a single phone call. 11 weeks. He had 11 weeks left. 30 years of clean service. A record without a single serious operational blemish, a retirement package and a pension, and a wife who had already picked out the colors for the workshop. He did not want to be the commander who put an entire FOB on crisis footing based on the analysis of a soldier with 4 psychological evaluations in her file. He did not want the battalion commander calling him to ask questions. He did not want the attention. He told himself it was probably nothing. He had been in this province for 8 months, and nothing significant had happened on his watch. And there was a reason for that, and the reason was sound defensive protocol and experienced leadership. And one new sergeant's pattern analysis was not going to change the assessment he had built over 8 months of careful observation. He told himself all of this, and he went to lunch, and he ate his meal, and he did not make the phone call. Wall was doing the calculus that junior officers do when they believe a subordinate and doubt their commander, and understand clearly that the gap between those two positions is one they must navigate with extreme care. He went back to Lexi's photographs that afternoon. He spread them on his own table and looked at them for a long time. The scope glint images, the village surveys, the vehicle tracks, the tactical overlay with the red markings at the breach points, and the dead ground between the towers. He was not a sniper. He was not a specialist in pattern recognition or threat assessment, but he was a man who had been in combat, who understood what prepared ground looked like versus unprepared ground, who had studied enough military history to recognize a pre-attack reconnaissance pattern when it was laid out clearly in front of him. He went to Finch's office. Finch told him battalion was reviewing it. Wall came back to his own office and sat with the maps for another hour. Then he went and found Otwell. Otwell listened to everything Wall said, standing against the wall of the motor pool, with his arms crossed and the flat, careful expression of a man assembling a structure from pieces he doesn't quite trust yet. When Wall was done, Otwell was quiet for a long time. "She's been on the wall every morning before dawn," he said finally, "every evening at dusk. She's been documenting that ridgeline for 8 days without missing a single session." "I know. And Finch has the file. He says battalion is looking at it." Otwell looked at him steadily. "You believe that?" Wall said nothing. They stood in the motor pool for another minute, the heat pressing down on the metal roofs around them, the smell of diesel and hot dust in the air. "What do you want to do?" Otwell asked. I want to add observation to the northern towers. Increased rotations. Extra eyes on that ridgeline at night. I can make that happen. Do it quietly. Don't make it a formal order. Just make sure we've got people watching. Otwell nodded. He pushed off the wall and walked away. And Wall stood alone in the motor pool and looked north toward the ridgeline he could barely see above the concrete barriers, and thought about a folder sitting in the bottom drawer of a desk belonging to a man who was thinking about paint colors for a workshop in Tennessee. The night before the new moon, Lexi did not sleep at all. She sat on the edge of her bunk with her rifle across her knees and her maps spread around her, and her go bag already packed and positioned at her feet where she could grab it in under 3 seconds. 400 rounds in that bag, double the standard combat load. Every magazine checked, loaded, and ready. Lund had made a joke about it when she had packed it 2 days ago, something about overreacting, and several people had laughed, and she had said nothing. She checked the lunar calendar one more time. New moon. Total darkness beginning at approximately 2100 and lasting through the early hours before dawn. She checked her rifle. Functioned perfectly, as it always did. She looked at the inscription on the stock. For Owen and Kestrel 7. Never again. She had made that inscription with shaking hands in the hour after the attack at FOB Kestrel, sitting in a corner of the aid station with 7 bodies laid out under olive drab blankets 20 feet away. She had borrowed a combat knife from a medic she had never met and cut the letters into the wood of the stock carefully, deliberately, the way you sign a document that you intend to honor for the rest of your life. She had been honoring it ever since. The base settled into its nighttime rhythms around her. Generators, radio chatter, the slow, reliable sounds of a place that believed itself to be adequately protected. Lund was asleep within minutes of hitting his bunk, the uncomplicated sleep of someone with a clear conscience and no unresolved premonitions. Voss read for 20 minutes, then set her book aside and closed her eyes. Otwell lay in the dark and was quiet in the way of a man who is not quite asleep and knows it. Lexi sat with her rifle and her maps in the new moon hiding in the dark sky above the Hindu Kush, and she watched the northern wall of the barracks as though she could see through it, through the plywood and the sandbags and the wire and the 200 meters of open ground, all the way to the ridgeline where, for the past 8 days, someone had been watching them back. She could feel it, not metaphorically, not as anxiety or intuition or the generalized hypervigilance that Finch's file had described in clinical language. As a physical reality, the way you feel the pressure change before a storm arrives, the way your body registers the information before your mind has processed it into language. They were coming. They had been planning this for weeks, watching the FOB's patterns with professional patience, mapping its rhythms, identifying its vulnerabilities. They believed they understood what they were walking into. They believed the darkness and the careful preparation and the precision of their reconnaissance gave them everything they needed. They did not know about the woman sitting in the dark in Building 3 with 400 rounds of ammunition at her feet and 8 days of their own movements documented and analyzed and mapped onto her memory. They did not know about Owen Decker or what it had cost to learn what she now knew. They did not know that for every hour they had spent watching FOB Ridgecrest, Lexi Carr had spent an equal hour watching them back. At 0143, the tonal quality of the FOB's ambient noise shifted in a way that was almost impossible to describe and completely impossible to ignore if you had spent 8 consecutive nights learning its baseline. The radio traffic from the northern tower changed cadence. Not louder, not more frequent, something subtler, a tightening in the rhythm of the transmissions, the clipped quality of voices that have seen something and are processing whether it rises to the level of an alert. Lexi was lacing her boots before she had consciously identified what she had heard. She checked her rifle one final time, picked up the go bag, settled it across her shoulders. 400 rounds, everything she would need. She looked around the barracks, her teammates sleeping. The ordinary, irreplaceable fact of people alive and unaware of what was moving toward them through the darkness. For Owen, she stood up, and then the first mortar round hit, and the night came apart. The explosion tore through the eastern end of the base with a sound that wasn't so much heard as experienced, a concussive pressure that hit the chest like a fist and rattled the plywood walls of Building 3 and shook dust from every surface. Then another, then a third, walking east to west across the compound with the deliberate, measured spacing of rounds fired by someone who knew exactly what they were aiming at. The TOC, the motor pool, the Eastern Guard Tower, precise, rehearsed, the product of 8 days of watching from a ridgeline 1,200 meters away. The barracks erupted into controlled chaos, bodies swinging off bunks, boots hitting the floor, the practiced urgency of soldiers executing a response they had drilled enough times that the muscle memory carried them through the first 10 seconds before conscious thought fully engaged. Voices overlapping, someone calling for Voss, the metallic sounds of weapons being grabbed and charged and readied. Lexi was already at the door. She had her rifle in both hands and her go bag across her shoulders, and she was moving before the second round had landed, her boots already laced, her mind already 3 steps ahead of the moment everyone else was still catching up to. She hit the door and pushed through into the night, in the cold air, and the orange light of something burning on the eastern side of the base. "Car!" Lund appeared behind her, half-dressed, his rifle in one hand. "What the?" "Northern wall," she said. "Now, the attack is coming from the east. The mortars are coming from the east." She turned and looked at him with those gray eyes, and there was something in them that stopped him mid-sentence. Not anger, not urgency in the ordinary sense. The absolute, undecorated certainty of someone who has already seen how this ends. "The assault is coming from the north. Right now. Move." She was already running. The base was full of people moving in the wrong direction. Soldiers streaming toward the eastern perimeter, where the mortar impacts were concentrated, where the fires were burning, where the obvious, invisible evidence of attack demanded response. Officers shouting, a vehicle burning near the motor pool sending a column of black smoke straight up into the moonless sky. The QRF assembling near the eastern gate, every face turned toward the flames. Lexi ran against all of it, against the current of every instinct that said, "Go where the fire is," against the gravitational pull of the obvious, toward the northern perimeter wall that sat in complete darkness and complete silence, and looked from every angle like the one part of the base that was not under attack, which was exactly what it was supposed to look like. She reached the northern fighting position, reinforced concrete barriers, 2 prepared firing points, a mounted M240 machine gun that had been added to this position 3 days ago after Wall's quiet conversation with Otwell. Voss was there ahead of her, already on the radio, her face pale in the darkness. And behind Voss, breathing hard from the run, his rifle across his chest and his expression stripped of every easy certainty it had carried for the past week. Lund. He had followed her. He didn't explain it. He didn't say anything. He just moved to the M240 and took position behind it and looked at her and waited. She didn't acknowledge it. There wasn't time. She was already at the firing point, the M110 up, and her eye pressed to the scope, the night vision painting the world in the pale green gradients of amplified starlight. And there they were, 50 meters into the scan, moving through the wadi in the precise formation she had predicted, using the terrain the way she had known they would use it, advancing on the exact breach points she had marked in red on her maps 8 days ago. Not a probe, not a feint, a committed assault force moving with the confidence of fighters who believed the ground ahead of them was undefended. Fire teams in staggered formation, RPG gunners positioned at the rear of each element for standoff fire capability. A PKM machine gun team moving on the left flank to establish a support by fire position. A leader element at the front, one man with a radio talking steadily, coordinating the approach. She counted signatures in the thermal image, stopped counting at 50. Contact north. Her voice was the same voice she used to read a map. Level, factual, a report, not an alarm. 50-plus enemy fighters, 900 meters in closing, moving in formation through the wadi. They are committed. This is 900 meters was long for an engagement in this light and these conditions. But she had been shooting in conditions like this since she was 19 years old, and the M110 in her hands had been fitted and zeroed and maintained to a standard that the Armory's general inventory didn't approach. She had the range cards memorized. She had measured the distances to every significant terrain feature in her field of fire. She knew exactly how the night air in this valley affected a projectile at this temperature. She identified the leader element, the man with the radio, moving at the front of the formation, coordinating the approach. Take the coordination away first. Take the heavy weapons second. Make every round count. Her breathing slowed. The world narrowed. She pressed the trigger. 870 meters away, the Taliban squad leader dropped without a sound. Mid-transmission, the radio still in his hand. The formation slowed for half a second. The involuntary hesitation of fighters who have just lost the voice telling them what to do. And in that half second, Lexi cycled the bolt and found the PKM machine gun team on the left flank. The gunner was still moving, still establishing his position, still believing he had time. He didn't. Second shot, the PKM gunner down. Third shot, the assistant gunner reaching for the weapon. Down before his hands closed on it. Lund opened up with the M240, and the northern perimeter erupted in controlled fire. Tracers arcing out into the darkness, finding the wadi, walking across the open ground where the assault force was now exposed and aware, and beginning to understand that the position they had planned to find empty was not empty at all. On the radio, Voss was talking steadily. Overwatch, northern position. Heavy contact, north wall. 50-plus enemy. Main assault. Request immediate reinforcement. I say again, the northern wall is taking the primary attack. The response was confused. Every frequency on the net was saturated with traffic from the eastern perimeter, from the QRF, from the TOC. It took 40 seconds, an eternity, before Wall's voice came through, clipped and taut. Northern position. Say again your contact report. Lieutenant, and the thermal feed from the drone that the night shift operator had managed to bring online in the chaos, showing a wave of heat signatures moving through the wadi toward the northern wall. Signatures that the eastern fight, for all its noise and fire, could not account for. He grabbed every soldier he could find and ran. But before he reached the door, he stopped at the desk where Finch had been running the base's defensive coordination since the attack began. The older man was on the radio, talking to battalion, his voice steady and precise. The voice of an experienced commander handling a crisis. Wall looked at the desk. The bottom drawer was slightly open, the way a drawer looks when it has been closed in a hurry. He pulled it open fully. Beneath 2 supply requisitions, the folder was there. 17 pages, annotated photographs, red-marked maps. He picked it up. He looked at Finch. Finch looked back at him. Neither man said anything. There was nothing to say that the moment had not already said more clearly and more completely than words could manage. Then Finch picked up the radio, and his voice went out across every frequency on the net. All units, all positions. Intel confirms primary assault is hitting the north wall. I say again, north wall is the main effort. All available personnel reinforce northern perimeter immediately. Wall was already gone. At the northern wall, Lexi had fired 11 shots. 11 shots, and the assault's command structure was gone. The heavy weapons capability was suppressed. The lead element had taken casualties severe enough to break its momentum and force the fighters behind it into cover positions in the wadi, where the terrain that had been their approach route was now trapping them in Lexi's field of fire. But there were still 40 fighters in that wadi, and they were adapting. She could see it in the thermal feed of her scope. The formation was breaking into smaller elements, 3 and 4 fighters each, dispersing laterally along the wadi to probe the flanks of the defensive position. Experienced fighters responding to unexpected resistance with the practical flexibility of men who had been in difficult situations before. They were no longer charging, they were thinking. "Flanking elements moving left," she said, her voice the same flat register it had held since the first shot. 3 fighters, using the rock formation at your 10 o'clock. Lund, shift left when I call it. Voss, keep the radio clear. She let the flanking element move until the lead fighter reached the gap she had anticipated. The specific position relative to the rock formation, where the angle of cover exposed a shootable portion of the human silhouette. She had studied that rock formation for 8 days. She knew it better than its own shadow. Shot 12. The lead flanker down. Shot 13. The second fighter frozen in the moment of processing what had just happened. Shot 14. The third man turning to run. Otwell arrived with 4 soldiers, sliding into the fighting position, breathing hard, taking in the scene with a single sweeping assessment, and then immediately adding his rifle to the line. He looked at the bodies visible in the approach, at the suppressed wadi, at Lexi shooting with the mechanical regularity of something that had been engineered specifically for this purpose. "Jesus," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "Right flank," Lexi said without looking at him. 2 fighters moving through the irrigation ditch, range 600 meters. They'll try to establish a support position behind that berm. He found them in his optic. He engaged. They didn't reach the berm. Wall arrived 4 minutes after the first shot, with a full fire team, then a second, the defensive line on the northern wall thickening by the minute, as soldiers who had been oriented east turned north and took position and added to the volume of fire pouring into the wadi. A Mk-19 grenade launcher appeared at the far end of the wall, mounted and loaded by soldiers who had been trained for exactly this scenario. The fight was no longer 3 people, but through all of it, Lexi's rifle continued its measured, precise cadence, finding the targets that the area fire missed, reaching the ranges that the other weapons in the position couldn't cover, working through the assault force with the systematic attention of someone who had a list and was moving through it. Shot 17. An RPG gunner raising his launcher toward the wall, close enough that the backblast would have been visible if it had fired, close enough to cause serious damage to the position. He didn't fire. Shot 18. A fighter attempting to drag the RPG gunner's launcher back into cover. Down. Shot 19. A man running. Shot 20. Another. Lund had to reload the M240 for the second time, his barrel glowing faintly in the darkness from the sustained fire. He looked at Lexi between reloads with an expression that had traveled a very long distance in a very short time from the easy mockery he had carried through the past week. "She hasn't missed," he said to no one, his voice carrying a quality close to bewilderment. "Not once. Not a single round." The Taliban reserve force came at 0312, 30 fighters held back for the exploitation phase, the element that was supposed to pour through the breach in the perimeter wire after the initial assault cleared the defenders. They came out of the wadi in a rush, moving fast, using the speed and volume of the assault to try to overwhelm whatever resistance remained. Lexi saw them coming in the thermal feed of her scope before they had fully cleared the wadi mouth. She saw the formation, the spacing, the intent written in the geometry of how they moved. Then the wind changed. It came off the northern face of the ridgeline in a cross gust that arrived without warning. The kind of pressure shift that happened in mountain valleys when temperature differentials reached a tipping point. Lexi felt it against her cheek. At the same moment, the thermal image in her scope began to swim and distort. The optics processing struggling with the sudden atmospheric disruption, heat signatures smearing at the edges, becoming unreliable. She could hear it, not the wind itself, but the frequency of it. the specific pitch it made moving through the rocky draws above the wadi, a low resonance in the range her father had taught her to identify when she was 9 years old, standing on the banks of the Flathead River in Montana with a rifle that was too heavy for her and a father who never said anything was too hard. "Listen before you read it," Walt Carr had told her, hunkered down beside her on the riverbank, his big Marine's hand steady on her shoulder. "The wind tells you everything. You just have to learn the language." She closed her eyes. For 4 seconds in the middle of a firefight, with 30 fighters moving toward the wire, Staff Sergeant Lexi Carr closed her eyes and listened. The wind was running left to right at approximately 12 kilometers per hour, gusting to 18 at 3-second intervals. The pattern irregular but not random. She could hear the rhythm of it in the way it moved through the ravine system above her position, the way it changed pitch when it hit the rock face at the northern end of the wadi. She calculated the correction without paper or formula, the way her father had taught her, the way 10,000 repetitions had made automatic what had once required conscious effort. She opened her eyes. The scope was still swimming. It didn't matter. "Lund," she said, "everything you've got, left to right across the formation. Don't stop." The M240 opened up, and the MK19 added its deeper percussion to the defensive line. And through all of it, Lexi put her cheek against the stock and shot by sound and memory, and the accumulated knowledge of 8 days spent studying ground that everyone else had dismissed as quiet. Her crosshairs found targets her scope could not fully render, and the rifle spoke anyway, each round placed where the geometry of the approach told her a human body would be. Shot 21, 22, 23. The reserve force's momentum broke 50 meters short of the wire. The survivors went to ground, some retreating toward the wadi, some crawling backward through the open hardpan. The return fire from their position became scattered and individual, the uncoordinated shooting of men who had lost their formation and were trying to find a way to still be alive in the next 30 seconds. Then the magazine ran dry. Not gradually, all at once, the way certainty ends. The bolt locked back on an empty chamber, and the rifle went silent in her hands for the first time in 41 minutes. Her right shoulder had stopped sending coherent pain signals 20 minutes ago and had moved into something deeper and more structural that she would deal with later. Her cheek was bleeding freely now, the stock having found the same torn skin on each of the last 30 impacts that it had found on the first. Her hands were moving before her mind had caught up, dropping the empty magazine, reaching for the next. She had one left. 17 magazines, 400 rounds. She had packed double because everyone had laughed. And now she was holding the last one, and the reserve force was still in the field, and the reinforcements were still 40 seconds away. She looked down at the stock. For Owen and Kestrel 7. Never again. She seated the final magazine, charged the weapon, put her eye back to the scope. "Last mag," she said. Her voice was completely level. "Make it count." She worked through it with the same measured precision she had brought to every round before it. No acceleration, no panic. The same rhythm from the first shot to the last, because her father had taught her that the most dangerous thing a marksman could do was rush the final rounds. And Owen had reinforced that lesson in 100 different ways across 3 deployments, and the names on her rifle stock were the permanent record of what happened when you let desperation override discipline. Shot 29, shot 30, shot 31. Wall was on the radio with battalion, calling in the contact report with controlled urgency. The numbers he was relaying producing a silence on the other end of the line that indicated the person receiving the report was recalibrating something significant. At 0341, the firing stopped. Not gradually, suddenly, with the finality of a door being closed. The last shots were individual and scattered, and then there was nothing. And the silence that followed had the particular quality of silence that exists only in the aftermath of sustained violence. Loaded, fragile, disbelieving. Lexi held her position, eye still at the scope, finger on the trigger guard, not the trigger. She scanned left to right across the northern approaches, slow and systematic, the way she had scanned the terrain every morning for 8 days. "I'm not calling it yet," she said to Wall beside her. "Give it 10 minutes." He didn't argue. They waited. The thermal feed showed nothing moving in the wadi except the residual heat signatures of bodies that were no longer a tactical problem. The ground sensors registered nothing. The drone feed showed scattered groups moving away from the FOB at distances that indicated retreat rather than repositioning. At 0352, Lexi lowered her rifle. Her hands were shaking. She had not noticed it while she was shooting. She noticed it now, the way you notice the cold after you've come inside. Not gradually, but all at once. The deferred physical reality of something her body had been holding at bay until the immediate necessity passed. The tremor was fine and persistent, the product of adrenaline withdrawal and physical exhaustion, and the kind of sustained muscular effort that the human body performs reliably and then presents the bill for in full. Otwell was beside her before she could take a step. His hand on her arm, steady and matter-of-fact, the way you catch someone who is about to fall without making it about the falling. She sat down against the concrete barrier. Voss was already kneeling beside her. Combat medic's hands moving with professional speed. The shoulder, the cheek, the hands still trembling. "How many rounds?" "Lost count after 250. Lexi's voice was rough, stripped down. "Magazine count is 17. 340 rounds, Lund said from behind the M240. He had been counting since the beginning. His voice had the quality of a man who has just witnessed something that has permanently rearranged his understanding of what is possible. Voss pressed a gauze pad against Lexi's cheek. "Significant soft tissue damage in the right shoulder. Deep tissue. This is going to hurt for weeks." She paused. "You need to be evaluated at a proper facility." "I stay with my unit, Sergeant." "I stay." Voss looked at her for a moment, then nodded and kept working. The intelligence team moved through the northern approach in the gray pre-dawn light with the careful efficiency of people cataloging a battlefield. The preliminary count was being relayed back to the TOC in real time, and the numbers produced the same quality of silence that Wall's radio call to battalion had produced. 34 confirmed enemy KIA in the northern sector alone. Blood trails indicating at least a dozen more wounded who had been carried away during the retreat. Total enemy casualties across all defensive sectors exceeded 50. Phobe Ridgecrest casualties. 3 wounded, none critical. Captain Finch walked the northern perimeter as the sun came up, and he did it slowly, and he did it alone. He walked from the fighting position where Lexi was sitting to the farthest body on the approach, which lay at a distance of 812 meters from the wall. He stood there for a moment looking back at the FOB, at the distance, at the ground, at the scope of what had been attempted here and what had stopped it. And then he walked back. He found Lexi sitting against the barrier with her rifle across her lap, accepting water from Voss, her face pale beneath the dried blood and the Afghan dust. He stood in front of her. He was a man who had spent 30 years being careful, and the care had served him well, and then, at the end, had failed the people he was responsible for in a way that he would spend the rest of his life accounting for. He knew this. He had known it since Wall had pulled the folder from his desk drawer and held it up in the firelit chaos of the TOC. "How did you know, Sergeant Carr?" His voice was not the voice of a superior addressing a subordinate. It was the voice of a man asking a genuine question. Lexi looked up at him. Her gray eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion, but the quality behind them, that particular depth, that stillness that went further down than it appeared to, was unchanged. "Because I never stopped looking, sir." She paused. "Everyone else saw a quiet sector. I saw a target being prepared. Everyone else saw normal village patterns. I saw people making space for what was coming." She looked at her hands, still faintly trembling, the M110 resting across her knees. I couldn't sleep because I already knew something was going to happen. The question was never whether I was right. The question was whether anyone would listen in time. Finch was quiet for a moment. Then he knelt down, which was not something a captain did in front of a staff sergeant, and met her eyes at the same level. I should have listened, he said. I let my assumptions override your evidence. That is on me. He paused. If you hadn't been in position when they came, he stopped. He didn't finish it. The math was simple and terrible and didn't require articulation. Lexi nodded once. She didn't say it was all right, because it wasn't, and she was not a person who said things for the sake of comfort that she did not believe to be true. The others came to her one at a time, in the slow aftermath of the battle as the sun climbed over the Hindu Kush, and the fires were put out and the damage was assessed, and the shape of what had almost happened became clear to everyone who stood in the northern approach and understood the arithmetic of how differently this could have gone. Otwell came first and said nothing, just put his hand briefly on her good shoulder and stayed there for a moment and then stepped back. It was enough. Voss came and sat beside her and didn't speak either, just shoulder to shoulder in the morning warmth, the simple physical presence of someone who had been there and was still there. Then Lund. He stood in front of her with the particular discomfort of a man who has been thoroughly and publicly wrong about something important. He was not a man built for this kind of reckoning. His confidence had always come easily, had always been available to him without effort. And now he was standing in front of the person he had mocked from the first moment she stepped off the helicopter. And the evidence of his error was lying in the approach behind him in the morning light. He stood at something close to attention. Sergeant Carr, he said, I owe you an apology, a real one. Not because you were right and I was wrong, though you were completely, but because I made it harder for you to do your job. I made it harder for you to be heard, and people could have died because of that. He stopped. He meant it. You could hear that he meant it in the way the words came out. Not rehearsed, not performed, but arrived at through the night's events with the slow, grinding effort of a man making himself see something he would have preferred not to see. That won't happen again. Lexi looked at him for a long moment. You stayed, she said. When everyone was going east and I was going north, you stayed. Yeah, that matters more than the other thing. He nodded. He stood there for another moment, not sure if there was more to say, then stepped back. Wall came last. He sat cross-legged on the ground in front of her, regardless of what his uniform looked like or what rank it indicated. And he looked at the woman who had arrived at FOB Ridgecrest 8 days ago, with a folder full of things no one wanted to hear, and a rifle she wouldn't put down, and a look in her eyes like someone listening for a sound no one else could detect. 34 confirmed, he said quietly. In the first 18 minutes before reinforcements reached the wall, it was 3 of you. You held this. He paused. I watched you shoot tonight, Lexi. I was here for the last 40 minutes of it. I watched you shoot, and I counted, and there was not a single wasted round. She was quiet. What happened to you at FOB Kestrel, he said carefully, made you into something that saved every person on this base tonight. It killed 7 people first, she said. I know. He didn't try to take that from her. Both things are true. She looked down at the stock of the M110, the inscription, 14 months of carrying it, 14 months of living at the surface of sleep, of watching every ridgeline, of being the person in every room who was scanning the exits while everyone else was eating their dinner. Owen would have been good at this, she said. It was a simple statement, factual, the kind of thing you say about someone when you've spent long enough carrying their absence that you know exactly the shape of what you lost. Better than me, probably. He could read terrain faster. He had better instincts for people. He trusted your instincts, Wall said. He ran for your rifle because he trusted your instincts. She sat with that for a moment. Then she nodded, slowly, the way you accept something that you have been holding at arm's length for a long time. Finch submitted his early retirement paperwork the morning after the battle. He did not announce it or explain it to anyone except Wall, to whom he said only, "I should have listened. I don't know how to lead people I don't fully trust. That's not something you fix with a better process." He would leave FOB Ridgecrest 6 weeks ahead of schedule, and the award ceremony was the last official act of his command. He stood straight through all of it. 3 weeks later, in the courtyard of FOB Ridgecrest, with the company assembled and the American flag rippling in the mountain wind, Captain Finch pinned the silver star to Lexi Carr's uniform for the second time. He read the citation in a voice that was steady and clear. Conspicuous gallantry, intrepidity at the risk of life, above and beyond the call of duty. Results that spoke with absolute finality to every question that had been asked about her judgment and her stability and her methods since the moment she stepped off the helicopter. The company applauded. Lund whistled, long and loud. Voss was crying and not attempting to hide it. In the weeks that followed, things changed at FOB Ridgecrest. In the quiet, organic way that things change when a community has been collectively wrong about something important and collectively survived the consequence of that wrongness, and decided together not to be wrong about it again. Lexi began running informal training sessions, not scheduled, not official, just soldiers sitting in the dust while she drew diagrams and talked through pattern recognition, terrain analysis, the behavioral signatures of a population preparing for conflict. How to read a village, how to read a ridgeline, how to trust the accumulation of small wrongnesses before any individual wrongness was large enough to demand attention on its own. The sessions grew. Other platoons started attending. A captain from Charlie Company came twice, asked careful questions, and took notes. Lund began keeping a daily observation journal. He brought it to Lexi each week, sitting across from her at the end of the chow hall after dinner, going through his entries one by one. "Am I seeing things that aren't there?" he asked every week. "Or am I finally seeing what's actually there?" She read each entry carefully and told him the truth, both about the overreach and about the legitimate observations. And he learned to tell the difference. And the difference was the most important skill she knew how to teach. Finch had submitted Lexi's methodology to Battalion for inclusion in the intelligence school's training curriculum before he left. The documents, the 17 pages, the annotated photographs, the tactical analysis that had been sitting in the bottom drawer of his desk while the new moon approached, were packaged into a training module and sent to Fort Huachuca with a cover letter describing what had almost happened, what had prevented it, and what every intelligence officer in the theater needed to understand about the difference between documented pattern analysis and the clinical category of hypervigilance. The formal establishment of Car Watch came on the FOB's weekly duty roster 3 weeks after the battle. A dedicated observation position on the northern wall, manned by a single volunteer each night, focused not on immediate threat response, but on long-term pattern documentation. The same terrain features, the same baseline photographs, the sustained analytical vigilance that required patience rather than reflexes, and produced results over days and weeks rather than seconds. The volunteer list filled up faster than any duty position the FOB had ever posted. On the 22nd night after the battle, Lexi slept. Not the surface rest she had maintained for 14 months, the controlled, watchful stillness that passed for sleep, but never reached the depth where the mind releases its grip on the present. Real sleep. The kind she had not allowed herself since the night before FOB Kestrel, when she had locked her rifle in the armory and lain down and decided, for one evening, to trust the systems. She did not plan it. She had cleaned her rifle, checked her go bag, positioned herself the way she always did, fully clothed, boots loosely laced, the M110 cradled along her body, her hand on the receiver. She closed her eyes and listened to the bass settle into its nighttime rhythms. And somewhere between one breath and the next, she went under. She dreamed of Owen Decker, not the Owen of the last time she had seen him, Not the 11 meters in the armory door and the terrible arithmetic of that night. The Owen from before. The Owen who used to sit across from her on patrol briefs and draw small, precise diagrams of terrain features he found interesting, purely for the pleasure of understanding them. The Owen who had once spent 40 minutes explaining to her, with complete seriousness, why a particular ridge in Helmand Province reminded him of a landscape painting he had seen in a museum in Chicago when he was 12 years old. In the dream, he was sitting on the northern wall of FOB Ridgecrest, looking out at the mountains in the early morning light. He turned when she approached and looked at her with the expression she remembered best. Attentive, warm, the expression of someone who is always genuinely glad to see you. He nodded once. "You did good, Lex," he said. "We can rest now." She woke at 400 with her face wet and her hands still on her rifle, and the quiet certainty of something that had been held tightly for a very long time, finally, carefully, being set down. Not dropped, not abandoned, set down deliberately, the way you place something precious on a safe surface, because you trust the surface to hold it. She lay still for a long time, watching the darkness in the barracks soften toward gray. And for the first time in 14 months, she did not immediately scan the room for threats. She simply lay there, breathing, present in the ordinary fact of being alive in a place that was, for now, safe. It was enough. On the last night before her rotation back to the States, Lexi walked the northern perimeter one final time. The mountains were the same mountains. The Hindu Kush in the darkness, immense and indifferent, the color of nothing at all. The FOB behind her was alive with its ordinary nighttime sounds, generators, radio chatter, the small human noises of a community that was still alive and did not fully understand how close it had come to being otherwise. She found Lund at the car watch position, sitting exactly where she had sat, the camera in his hands, photographing the northern ridgeline in the fading evening light. He didn't hear her approach. He was focused on the terrain, moving the camera slowly and systematically from left to right across the ridgeline, the way she had taught him. She stood and watched him work. After a moment, he lowered the camera and made a notation in his observation journal, and only then did he look up and see her. "Evening, Sergeant." He didn't seem surprised. "Just finishing the baseline. Everything matches the pattern from the past week. Shepherds on the normal routes. Village activity consistent, no anomalies." "Good, but I'm still watching." He closed the journal. "Because the moment we stop watching is when they'll come back." She looked at him for a moment, at the journal and the camera and the position he had taken on the wall, not because he had been ordered to, but because he had been there on the night it mattered, and had understood what it meant to be there, and what it would have meant not to be. "You've learned well," she said. They sat together for a while in the evening quiet, watching the same mountains that had hidden the fighters who had come for them in the dark 3 weeks ago. The mountains looked peaceful. They always looked peaceful. That was the thing about mountains. They held their secrets with perfect indifference, gave nothing away, waited with a patience that made human planning look provisional and brief. "Can I ask you something?" Lund said. She nodded. "Does it ever get easier? The watching, the waiting, the not being able to turn it off?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said finally. "It doesn't get easier. It gets more familiar. You learn to carry it without putting it down." She was quiet for a moment. "But it gets purposeful. That's different from easier. Purposeful means you know why you're carrying it." He nodded slowly. The sun was fully gone now, the ridgeline a dark mass against a slightly less dark sky, the stars beginning to appear one at a time in the cold altitude air. "Why did you become a sniper?" he asked. "My father taught me to shoot," she said, "on the Flathead River in Montana. He was a Marine. He said the most important thing a marksman learns is patience, that the shot you don't take until the moment is exactly right will always be better than the shot you take because you got tired of waiting." She paused. My mother died when I was 7. My father used to say she taught him that too, that you don't get unlimited time with the people you're trying to protect. So you protect them as well as you can with the time you have. Lund was quiet. Owen understood that, she said. He understood it before I could articulate it. That's why he ran for my rifle. Not because he was reckless, because he knew exactly what the rifle meant and what I would have been without it. She looked down at the stock, the inscription, small, uneven letters cut by shaking hands in the worst hour of her life. I carry his name because carrying it keeps me honest. It keeps me from ever deciding that one night of normal is worth the risk. The FOB was settling into its nighttime rhythms behind them. Someone was laughing in the distant barracks. A radio crackled and went quiet. The ordinary, irreplaceable sounds of people alive and moving and unaware of what had nearly been taken from them. Lexi stood up. She picked up her rifle and settled it in her hands, the way she had held it every day for 14 months, the way she would hold it tomorrow and the day after that, and in every forward operating base, and every deployment, and every night when the darkness came down over the mountains, and something moved through it that meant harm to the people she had decided to protect. She looked out at the northern ridgeline one last time. "Take care of them," she said. She wasn't speaking to Lund. Then she turned and walked back through the FOB toward the barracks, through the pools of light from the guard towers, past the chow hall still lit with someone washing the last of the dinner dishes, past Building 3 where her rucksack was packed and waiting. She moved the way she always moved, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had somewhere to be and knew exactly what needed to happen before she got there. In the morning, she would board the helicopter. She would fly back to Bagram, and then to a transport, and then home to a country that would never fully know what had happened on the northern wall of FOB Ridgecrest on a moonless night in Kunar province. She would go through the medical evaluation and let the doctors tell her what she already knew about her shoulder. She would sleep in a bed somewhere that wasn't a forward operating base, with her rifle beside her, and she would wait for the next deployment and the next ridgeline and the next set of faces that didn't know her yet. She would do the things she had promised Owen Decker she would do. She would keep watching. At 0600 the following morning, the Chinook lifted off the landing pad of FOB Ridgecrest and climbed into the pale morning sky above the Hindu Kush. Lexi sat in the cargo bay with her rifle in both hands and watched through the open door as the base fell away below her. On the northern wall, in the position that bore her name on the duty roster, Lund stood at the barrier with a camera and a notebook, photographing the ridgeline in the morning light, beginning the baseline documentation for the day. He did not look up. He was doing his job. She watched until the base was small below her, and then smaller, and then gone behind a fold in the mountains. She held her rifle and faced forward. She was ready for whatever came next. She was always ready.